Now we've covered symmetric and asymmetric algorithms, but now we want to talk about the application of some of the technologies we've discussed. Now when we get into public key cryptography, we're really talking about the use of private and public keys. Public key cryptography uses the asymmetric encryption methods and algorithms that we talked about earlier, and it requires a pair of related keys. And we know that pair of related keys as a public and a private key. Now these public and private key pairs are used to encrypt, digitally sign, and verify data that's sent over networks or even the big internet, and it uses these public or private keys to do so. You can also use these public and private key pairs to digitally sign message, to ensure integrity, and to perform a wide variety of other cryptographic functions. Now, one thing that public key cryptography can also do for you is it can also solve the problem of sending symmetric keys, in other words, secret keys, from one party to another securely. Remember, we talked about symmetric algorithms such that key exchange is an issue. And the reason for this is we have one key that can encrypt and decrypt, but getting that key to the other party may require some more hidden methods of doing so. Simply sending it in an email or handing them a piece of paper with the key on there is not very secure. So the solution to this would be to use public key cryptography to encrypt the key and send it and have the other user decrypt using their private key. So let's go a little bit more into public key cryptography here. The public key, as a reminder, is the encryption key that is distributed freely to anyone requiring it. You don't have to worry about distributing this key. You can send it to anyone you like. It doesn't matter. It does not have to be sent securely. In fact, it can be downloaded from a centralized store on the internet. The private key, on the other hand, that's the key that you keep secure and confidential, and you never give that to anyone. You never transmit that to anyone at all. Now, the public key encrypts a message, but only the private key can decrypt. Let me give you a reminder here. Whatever one key encrypts, only the other key can decrypt. So if the public key encrypts it, only the corresponding private key that the user has can decrypt it. So if you want to keep something confidential, I might use Tim's public key to encrypt something, and then only Tim's private key can decrypt it. So only he can decrypt that message. Now anyone can encrypt and send it to Tim, but only Tim can decrypt it. And if Tim wanted to send me a encrypted message, he might encrypt using my public key and send it to me, and then only my private key could decrypt it. So even if everybody has my public key, Tim encrypts with my public key, and even though other people have my public key, they can't decrypt it. They don't know what Tim put in the message. Only I can do that. Only the private key can do that. Now, when we're talking about digital signatures, which we'll cover a little bit later, the reverse actually happens. You can use the private key to encrypt a hash or a digest of a message or even the message itself, and the public key can decrypt it. So if I encrypt something with my private key and throw it out there on the internet, anyone could decrypt it because they have the public key. So you might be thinking, well, that's not very confidential. Well, confidentiality is not what I'm trying to ensure right there. If I encrypt with my private key, anyone can decrypt it. What that means, though, is that since only I possess the private key, it's considered signed by me and authentic, because only I could have sent that message, encrypted and sent it. So that's really the basis of a digital signature, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, public keys have to be reliably distributed to prove that they're tied to the corresponding private key. And the way this happens is through a digital certificate. And digital certificates are issued from trusted sources called CAs. And that's the subject of our next session, is how digital certificates are managed throughout their life cycle. In any case, this digital certificate is issued from the trusted source. It verifies my identity as the user, and it verifies my connection to my private key. It verifies that they go together. A digital certificate uses something called the X.509 standard. Now, you probably won't need to know this for the exam, but you do need to know it as far as your information security knowledge goes. Now, server certificates are also used for digital certificates, and how we use these server certificates is for authentication between a host and a server, for example. If you go and buy something from, say, Amazon.com or some other online merchant, what you're typically doing is verifying the server's identity before you send them sensitive information, like a credit card number, for example. These web servers use a technology called Secure Sockets Layer, or SSL, which basically encrypts the transmission between the host and the server. Now, this host and the server encryption has to happen some way. There has to be keys exchanged. So we use public key cryptography for that. So public key cryptography is used in these server certificates for secure transactions. We can also use public key cryptography for things like file encryption, where we encrypt a file on a host. It sits on the file system. We encrypt with a private key so that anyone else can decrypt it with the public key that we send out, or vice versa. It's encrypted with our public key and only our private key can decrypt it. We also use public key cryptography for VPN authentication. In other words, authenticating across the internet through a secure tunnel to a trusted network, say our work network. So public key cryptography actually has a lot of applications and uses. And in our next session, we're going to talk a little bit about the logistics and infrastructure involved with managing public and private key pairs.